Behind the golden gates of Buckingham Palace, three explosive secrets were about to shatter everything the world thought it knew about the British royal family. In January 2025, a single leaked document would expose decades of hidden truths, forbidden love affairs, and a conspiracy that reached the highest levels of government. What started as whispers in palace corridors would become the most shocking royal scandal in modern history, forcing a thousand-year-old institution to confront its darkest moments while the entire world watched in disbelief. This is not just another royal story. This is the untold truth about power, betrayal, and the price of keeping secrets in the digital age. These are the stories that changed 2025 forever. The morning mist hung heavy over London as Sarah Mitchell, a junior archivist at the Royal Archives, made her way through the underground tunnels beneath Buckingham Palace. It was January 15, 2025, and what should have been another routine day cataloging historical documents would instead become the moment that changed the monarchy forever. Sarah had been working in the archives for 3 years, quietly organizing centuries of royal correspondence, state papers, and personal letters that few people would ever see. She loved the solitude of her work, the smell of old paper, and the feeling that she was a guardian of history. But nothing could have prepared her for what she would discover in a forgotten filing cabinet tucked away in the deepest part of the archives. The filing cabinet was labeled simply Miscellaneous Correspondence 1952 to 1975 and had been sealed with official government tape that had yellowed with age. Sarah had been tasked with digitizing these older documents as part of a modernization project ordered by the new King's administration. As she carefully cut through the tape and opened the first drawer, she expected to find the usual collection of diplomatic letters and ceremonial documents. Instead, she found herself staring at a collection of handwritten letters that made her hands tremble as she read them. The first letter, written on official palace stationery, was dated December 1953 and signed by a name that made Sarah's breath catch in her throat. It was from someone whose identity, if revealed, would send shockwaves through the Commonwealth and beyond. The letter detailed a secret meeting that had taken place between high-ranking members of the royal family and representatives of a foreign government. But this wasn't ordinary diplomatic correspondence. The language was coded, but the implications were clear: sensitive state secrets had been shared, money had changed hands, and decisions had been made that directly contradicted the public positions of the British government at the time. As Sarah continued reading, she realized she was looking at evidence of something that historians had long suspected but never been able to prove. The royal family, supposedly above politics and neutral in all matters of state, had been actively involved in covert operations that could have changed the course of the Cold War. But the personal revelations were even more shocking than the political ones. Hidden among the official correspondence were love letters that revealed secret relationships, illegitimate children, and cover-ups that had been carefully orchestrated to protect the reputation of the monarchy. One particular exchange, spanning several months in 1961, detailed a passionate affair between a senior royal and a prominent political figure's spouse. The letters spoke of midnight meetings, coded telephone calls, and desperate attempts to keep their relationship secret from both the press and their respective families. The most devastating discovery came in a folder marked Project Nightingale. The documents inside revealed a systematic effort to suppress negative stories about the royal family through a network of journalists, editors, and government officials who had been secretly paid to kill unfavorable coverage. The operation had been running for decades, and its influence extended far beyond Britain's borders, reaching newspapers and media outlets across Europe and the Commonwealth. Sarah's hands shook as she photographed each document with her phone. She knew that what she was seeing could destroy reputations, end careers, and potentially bring down the monarchy itself. But she also knew that the public had a right to know the truth about the institution they were asked to support with their taxes and loyalty. As word of her discovery began to spread through carefully cultivated contacts in the media, Sarah found herself at the center of a storm that was building across the country. Investigative journalists who had been digging into royal finances for years suddenly had the smoking gun they needed to prove their theories. Political opponents of the monarchy saw an opportunity to push for Republican reform. And, within the palace walls, panic was setting in as advisors realized that their carefully constructed public image was about to come crashing down. The first major newspaper to run the story was The Guardian, whose royal correspondent had been quietly investigating suspicious financial transactions involving royal estates for over 2 years. When Sarah's documents provided the missing pieces of the puzzle, the paper's editors knew they were sitting on the biggest royal scandal since the abdication crisis of 1936. The headline that appeared on January 22, 2025, was simple but devastating: "Secret royal files reveal decades of hidden deals and forbidden affairs." The article, written by veteran investigative journalist David Cameron, carefully laid out the evidence Sarah had uncovered, corroborating each revelation with additional research and expert analysis. The public reaction was immediate and intense. Social media exploded with hashtags like #RoyalSecrets and #PalaceGate. Protesters gathered outside Buckingham Palace demanding answers, while supporters of the monarchy insisted that the documents were either forgeries or taken out of context. The BBC found itself in the unprecedented position of having to provide wall-to-wall coverage of a story that directly challenged the institution they had spent decades respectfully covering. But the revelations were only the beginning. As more journalists began digging into the story, additional sources came forward with their own evidence of royal misconduct. A former palace aide revealed that she had been paid to keep quiet about witnessing drug use at royal parties. A retired security officer admitted that he had been ordered to destroy evidence of financial improprieties involving royal charities. A prominent socialite, now in her 80s, finally spoke about her secret relationship with a royal family member that had produced a child who was quietly adopted and whose existence had been hidden from the public for over 40 years. The international press picked up the story with relish, and, suddenly, the British royal family found themselves facing the kind of scrutiny they had never experienced before. American networks sent teams of reporters to London, German newspapers ran exposés about the monarchy's wartime activities, and Australian media questioned whether their country should continue to recognize the British monarch as their head of state. Within the palace, crisis meetings were being held around the clock as advisors struggled to develop a response strategy. Traditional approaches of dignified silence or carefully worded denials were proving inadequate in the face of such overwhelming evidence. The King's private secretary, Sir Edmund Hartwell, found himself facing the most challenging period of his 30-year career in royal service. The pressure was particularly intense on the younger members of the royal family, who had grown up believing they were part of an institution built on duty, honor, and service to the nation. Prince William, heir to the throne, was reportedly devastated by the revelations about his grandmother's generation and struggled with how to address the crisis while maintaining his own credibility with the public. As January drew to a close, it became clear that this was not a scandal that would blow over with time and careful management. The evidence was too substantial, the public interest too intense, and the questions too fundamental to be swept under the royal carpet. The monarchy would have to confront its past in a way it never had before, and the outcome would determine whether this 1,000-year-old institution could survive in the modern world. The story was far from over. In fact, it was just beginning, and the revelations that would emerge in the coming weeks would prove even more shocking than anything Sarah Mitchell had found in that dusty filing cabinet beneath Buckingham Palace. The monarchy was about to face its greatest crisis in centuries, and no one could predict how it would end. Public opinion polls showed the monarchy's approval ratings plummeting to their lowest levels in recorded history. Constitutional experts began debating whether the revelations constituted grounds for abdication or even the abolition of the monarchy altogether. And, in quiet corners of Westminster, politicians who had never dared to question the royal system began whispering about the possibility of a republican future for Britain. The royal family themselves retreated behind closed doors, cancelling public engagements and refusing all media requests for comment. But their silence only fueled more speculation and gave their critics more ammunition to use against them. It was a crisis unlike anything they had faced before, and traditional royal crisis management techniques seemed completely inadequate to address the scale and severity of the scandal. As February began, new revelations emerged almost daily. Each morning brought fresh headlines, new witnesses coming forward, and additional evidence of royal misconduct spanning decades. The story had taken on a life of its own, and there seemed to be no end in sight to the damage it was causing to Britain's most famous family. The world watched in fascination as one of the most powerful and respected monarchies in the world struggled to maintain its dignity and relevance in the face of overwhelming evidence of corruption, deception, and abuse of power. It was a real-time collapse of a centuries-old institution, broadcast live to a global audience that couldn't look away from the spectacle. What had started as a routine archival project had become a constitutional crisis that threatened to tear apart the very fabric of British society. And this was only the beginning of a story that would dominate headlines for months to come, revealing truths that would change how the world viewed monarchy, power, and the price of keeping secrets in the modern age. Dr. Elizabeth Turner had spent 20 years as a forensic accountant, untangling complex financial schemes for major corporations and government agencies. But nothing in her extensive experience had prepared her for the call she received on February 3, 2025, from the editors of the Financial Times. They needed someone with her expertise to examine financial documents that had surfaced as part of the ongoing royal scandal, and what she would discover would expose a web of financial corruption that stretched across continents and involved some of the most powerful people in the world. The documents that landed on Elizabeth's desk told a story of systematic financial manipulation that had been carefully hidden for decades. The royal family, through a complex network of trusts, shell companies, and offshore accounts, had been engaged in financial activities that violated both the spirit and letter of their constitutional role as politically neutral figureheads. The trail began with the Duchy of Cornwall, the private estate that traditionally provides income for the heir to the throne. Elizabeth's analysis revealed that the duchy had been used as a front for far more sophisticated financial operations than anyone had previously suspected. Money had been flowing through the estate from sources that included arms dealers, corrupt foreign officials, and companies with ties to organized crime. One particularly damaging discovery involved a series of payments totaling over £50 million that had been funneled through the duchy from a Saudi arms dealer who was later convicted of facilitating weapons sales to terrorist organizations. The payments had been disguised as legitimate business investments, but Elizabeth's forensic analysis showed that no actual business activity had taken place. The money had simply been laundered through the royal estate and, then, distributed to various members of the royal family through a complex system of trusts and allowances. Even more shocking was the discovery that similar arrangements had been made with oligarchs from Russia, Ukraine, and several African nations. The royal family had essentially been running a high-end money laundering operation, using their prestige and political connections to help corrupt foreign officials hide stolen assets in British financial institutions. The investigation revealed that Prince Andrew, who had already faced significant controversy over his relationship with Jeffrey Epstein, had been the primary architect of these financial arrangements. Working with a small group of trusted advisors and offshore banking specialists, he had created what amounted to a parallel financial system that operated completely outside normal regulatory oversight. The scheme had been incredibly sophisticated, involving banks in Switzerland, the Cayman Islands, and Dubai, as well as investment firms in New York and Hong Kong. Money would enter the system through seemingly legitimate business deals, then be moved through multiple accounts and jurisdictions before finally ending up in trusts that benefited various members of the royal family. Elizabeth's analysis showed that over the past 30 years, more than £2 billion had flowed through this system. The money had paid for everything from private jets and luxury yachts to real estate purchases and art acquisitions. It had also been used to fund political campaigns in several Commonwealth countries and to pay bribes to officials who helped facilitate additional corrupt deals. The revelation that the monarchy had been profiting from blood money and stolen assets sent shockwaves through British society. The moral authority that the royal family had claimed for centuries was now being questioned at the most fundamental level. How could an institution that was supposed to represent the highest values of British society have been so deeply involved in corruption and criminal activity? The financial scandal also had immediate political implications. The Conservative government, which had long been closely associated with the monarchy, found itself under intense pressure to explain how such extensive criminal activity could have taken place without government knowledge or intervention. Opposition parties demanded parliamentary investigations and called for the immediate suspension of all public funding for the royal family. Prime Minister Rishi Sunak, already facing declining poll numbers and growing economic challenges, was forced to address the crisis in an emergency session of Parliament. His attempts to distance the government from the royal scandal were undermined when additional documents revealed that several Conservative politicians had received donations from the same offshore accounts that had been used to launder money for foreign criminals. The international ramifications were equally severe. The United States Treasury Department announced that it was launching its own investigation into potential violations of American money laundering laws. The European Union indicated that it might impose sanctions on British financial institutions that had facilitated the corrupt transactions. And several Commonwealth countries began questioning whether they wanted to maintain their constitutional ties to a monarchy that had been profiting from criminal activity. As Elizabeth continued her analysis, she uncovered evidence of even more disturbing financial arrangements. The royal family had apparently been providing financial services to dictators and human rights abusers from around the world. Money from arms sales in conflict zones, proceeds from human trafficking operations, and funds stolen from humanitarian aid programs had all found their way into royal accounts. One of the most heartbreaking discoveries involved money that had been stolen from disaster relief funds intended for victims of the 2004 Indian Ocean tsunami. Corrupt officials in several affected countries had diverted millions of dollars in aid money, which had then been laundered through the royal financial network. The money that should have gone to build schools and hospitals for tsunami survivors had instead been used to purchase jewelry and artwork for members of the British royal family. The human cost of these financial crimes was becoming increasingly clear as journalists and investigators followed the money back to its sources. In Bangladesh, entire villages remained without clean water because development funds had been stolen and laundered through London. In Nigeria, children continued to die from preventable diseases because money intended for medical supplies had been diverted into royal accounts. In Ukraine, families had lost their homes and livelihoods because officials had stolen reconstruction funds and hidden the proceeds in British banks. The scale and scope of the corruption was overwhelming, but Elizabeth was determined to follow every lead and expose every dirty transaction. Her team worked around the clock, analyzing millions of financial records and tracing money flows across dozens of countries and hundreds of financial institutions. The investigation also revealed the extent to which the Royal Financial Network had corrupted British institutions. Major banks including Barclays, HSBC, and NatWest had all been complicit in facilitating the money laundering operations. They had accepted obviously suspicious deposits, failed to conduct proper due diligence on their royal clients, and actively helped to structure transactions to avoid regulatory scrutiny. Senior executives at these banks had been rewarded for their cooperation with knighthoods, honorary degrees, and lucrative consulting contracts. The corruption had reached into every level of the British establishment, creating a culture where criminal activity was not only tolerated but actively encouraged as long as it benefited the right people. The Bank of England itself had been compromised, with several senior officials providing advance warning to royal advisors about potential investigations and regulatory actions. The central bank's reputation for integrity and independence, built up over centuries, was now in tatters as evidence emerged of systematic corruption at the highest levels. Law enforcement agencies found themselves in an impossible position. The evidence of criminal activity was overwhelming, but prosecuting members of the royal family would require unprecedented legal action that could destabilize the entire constitutional system. Scotland Yard launched a formal investigation, but officers were reportedly struggling with the political and practical challenges of building criminal cases against some of the most powerful people in the country. International law enforcement agencies were more aggressive in their response. Interpol issued notices for several individuals connected to the Royal Financial Network, and prosecutors in France, Germany, and Italy began building cases against European accomplices who had helped facilitate the money laundering operations. The Swiss government, facing intense international pressure to crack down on money laundering, announced that it was freezing hundreds of accounts linked to the royal scandal. This action effectively cut off one of the primary channels that had been used to move corrupt money into the British financial system. As February progressed, new financial revelations emerged almost daily. Each discovery was more shocking than the last, and it became clear that the full extent of royal financial corruption might never be fully understood. The system had been so complex and so well hidden that even expert investigators were struggling to trace all of the connections and identify all of the victims. The human stories behind the financial crimes began to emerge as journalists traveled to affected countries to interview victims. They met with families who had lost everything because of corruption, children who had been denied education and healthcare, and communities that remained in poverty because development funds had been stolen. These personal stories gave a face to the abstract financial crimes and helped the British public understand the real-world consequences of royal corruption. The monarchy was no longer just facing a political scandal or a constitutional crisis. They were confronting evidence that their financial crimes had directly contributed to human suffering on a massive scale. The pressure for accountability was building from every direction. Religious leaders called for moral reckoning and demanded that stolen money be returned to its rightful recipients. Human rights organizations filed lawsuits seeking compensation for victims of royal financial crimes. And ordinary British citizens began questioning whether they wanted to continue supporting an institution that had profited from so much suffering. The royal family remained largely silent about the financial revelations, but their few public statements seemed tone-deaf and inadequate in the face of such overwhelming evidence of wrongdoing. Their lawyers issued technical denials and claimed that all financial activities had been conducted within the law, but these legalistic responses only further damaged their public credibility. Behind the scenes, royal advisors were reportedly in complete chaos as they struggled to develop a strategy for addressing the crisis. Traditional approaches of dignified silence and gradual rehabilitation were clearly inadequate for a scandal of this magnitude. Some advisors reportedly advocated for full disclosure and cooperation with investigators, while others pushed for aggressive legal defense and attempts to discredit the evidence. The financial scandal was also having immediate practical consequences for the royal family. Several major banks froze royal accounts pending investigation, making it difficult for them to conduct even routine financial transactions. Insurance companies canceled policies on royal properties, citing the legal and reputational risks associated with the ongoing investigations. Corporate sponsors began distancing themselves from royal charities and events, unwilling to be associated with an institution that was facing such serious criminal allegations. Several prominent companies that had held royal warrants for decades announced that they were reviewing their relationships with the monarchy. The tourism industry, which had long promoted Britain's royal heritage as a major attraction, found itself in an impossible position. International visitors were still fascinated by the royal scandal, but they were increasingly critical of the institution itself. Tourist sites associated with the monarchy saw declining visitor numbers as people became uncomfortable celebrating an institution that was associated with such extensive criminal activity. As the month drew to a close, it became clear that the financial scandal had fundamentally changed the relationship between the monarchy and British society. The royal family was no longer seen as above politics or immune from criticism. They were now viewed as potential criminals who needed to be held accountable for their actions, just like any other citizens. The investigation was far from over, and Elizabeth Turner knew that she had only scratched the surface of royal financial corruption. But what she had already discovered was enough to shake the foundations of the British establishment and force a complete re-evaluation of the monarchy's role in modern society. The question was no longer whether the royal family would survive the scandal, but whether British democracy could survive the revelation that its most respected institutions had been so thoroughly corrupted. The financial web was unraveling, and no one could predict what would be left when the last thread was finally pulled. Colonel James Harrison had served in the Special Air Service for 15 years before transitioning to a role in Royal Protection Services. His military record was impeccable, his loyalty unquestioned, and his discretion absolute. But, on March 8, 2025, sitting in a secure meeting room deep beneath Thames House, the headquarters of MI5, Harrison was about to reveal secrets that would expose the darkest chapter in the history of Britain's intelligence services. The meeting had been arranged by Sir David Wright, a senior civil servant who had spent his entire career navigating the murky waters where national security, politics, and royal protection intersected. Wright had read the mounting evidence of royal corruption with growing alarm, but what truly terrified him were the implications for national security that were beginning to emerge from the investigation. Harrison had initially resisted all attempts to get him to speak about his experiences protecting the royal family. His oath of loyalty was sacred to him, and he had spent years keeping the secrets he had witnessed during his service. But the revelations about financial corruption had shaken him to his core, and when Wright assured him that his testimony was essential for national security, Harrison finally agreed to break his silence. What Harrison revealed that day would ultimately prove more damaging to the monarchy than any financial scandal or personal indiscretion. He described a systematic pattern of royal family members sharing classified information with foreign agents, using their privileged access to state secrets as bargaining chips in personal and financial negotiations. The most serious breach involved Prince Andrew's relationship with several Russian oligarchs who were later identified as intelligence assets working for the SVR, Russia's foreign intelligence service. Harrison had personally witnessed Andrew sharing sensitive military information during social gatherings at royal residences, apparently unaware that his new friends were systematically collecting intelligence that would later be used against British interests. But Andrew was not the only member of the royal family who had been compromised. Harrison described how Princess Anne had been manipulated by a Chinese businessman who was actually a colonel in the People's Liberation Army Intelligence Service. Over several months, he had carefully cultivated a relationship with her, eventually gaining access to classified information about British military capabilities and defense strategies. Even more shocking was Harrison's account of how the late Prince Philip had been approached by Israeli intelligence services who were seeking information about British nuclear capabilities. Philip, apparently believing he was helping a friendly ally, had provided detailed briefings about the locations and security arrangements for Britain's nuclear weapons facilities. The security breaches went far beyond individual indiscretions. Harrison described how the palace had become a virtual intelligence marketplace, with foreign operatives from dozens of countries working to cultivate relationships with royal family members and their staff. The Russians, Chinese, Israelis, Saudis, and Americans all had active operations targeting the monarchy, and many of them had been remarkably successful. The intelligence agencies had been aware of some of these security breaches for years, but they had been unable to take effective action because of the constitutional protections surrounding the royal family. Any serious investigation would have required confronting the monarchy directly, something that senior intelligence officials were reluctant to do without clear political backing. Sir David Wright's revelation of this intelligence catastrophe had immediate and devastating consequences for Britain's relationships with its closest allies. The Five Eyes intelligence partnership with the United States, Canada, Australia, and New Zealand was immediately suspended pending a full security review. American intelligence officials were reportedly furious that decades of classified information sharing had been compromised by royal family indiscretions. The NATO alliance also demanded an urgent review of Britain's security clearances and access to classified military information. Several European allies indicated that they would be restricting intelligence sharing until Britain could demonstrate that its security procedures had been reformed and the royal family could no longer access sensitive information. Wright's testimony also revealed how the security services themselves had been compromised by their relationship with the monarchy. Senior MI5 and MI6 officers had been systematically recruited to provide protection for royal security breaches, helping to cover up evidence of intelligence leaks and foreign penetration. One particularly damaging case involved Sir Marcus Pemberton, a former head of MI6 who had spent years helping to protect Prince Andrew from the consequences of his security breaches. Pemberton had used his position to suppress investigations, intimidate whistleblowers, and provide false information to parliamentary oversight committees. The corruption had reached the highest levels of the security establishment. Sir Jeremy Fleming, the head of GCHQ, Britain's electronic intelligence agency, had reportedly been blackmailed into providing communications intercepts that helped royal family members monitor journalists and political opponents who were investigating royal scandals. The domestic intelligence service MI5 had been similarly corrupted, with several senior officers using surveillance capabilities to spy on royal critics and potential witnesses to royal crimes. Phone taps, email monitoring, and physical surveillance had all been used to protect the monarchy from accountability, representing a massive abuse of power that violated the fundamental principles of democratic oversight. Harrison's revelations also exposed how the security services had been used to facilitate royal financial crimes. MI6 officers had provided intelligence about foreign targets that helped royal financial advisors identify corrupt officials who might be willing to launder money through British accounts. The intelligence services had essentially become criminal facilitators, using state resources to help the royal family profit from corruption. The international intelligence implications were staggering. British intelligence officers stationed around the world found themselves under suspicion from their foreign counterparts, who now questioned whether any classified information shared with Britain would remain secure. Decades of carefully built intelligence relationships were destroyed overnight as allies implemented emergency security protocols to protect themselves from further British leaks. The domestic consequences were equally severe. Parliamentary intelligence oversight committees demanded immediate access to all files related to royal security arrangements, but they were told that many crucial documents had been destroyed or were missing. The intelligence agencies claimed that normal document retention policies had been followed, but critics suspected that evidence was being systematically destroyed to prevent full accountability. The Prime Minister was forced to address the intelligence crisis in a special parliamentary session, but his attempts to reassure allies and the public were undermined by almost daily revelations of new security breaches. Opposition parties demanded his resignation, arguing that the government must have known about the royal security problems but failed to take appropriate action. Behind closed doors, senior civil servants and intelligence officials were reportedly in open revolt against their political masters. They argued that they had been placed in impossible positions, forced to choose between their duty to protect national security and their constitutional obligation to serve the crown. Many were demanding legal immunity for their past actions and threatening to resign en masse if they were made scapegoats for the crisis. The security scandal also revealed the extent to which foreign intelligence services had penetrated British society through their relationships with the royal family. Russian operatives had gained access to exclusive social events, private clubs, and charitable organizations that served as informal networks for Britain's political and business elite. Chinese intelligence had been even more sophisticated in their approach, using academic exchanges, business partnerships, and cultural programs to build relationships that eventually led to access to classified information. They had essentially turned the royal family's social network into an intelligence-gathering operation that had been running undetected for decades. The revelations about Israeli intelligence operations were particularly damaging because they involved a supposed ally who had been systematically spying on British nuclear facilities and defense installations. The breach of trust was so severe that several senior British officials called for a complete review of the intelligence-sharing relationship with Israel. Harrison's testimony also revealed how foreign intelligence services had used their royal connections to influence British foreign policy decisions. Russian operatives had successfully lobbied for policy changes that benefited Russian interests, while Chinese intelligence had gained advanced knowledge of British negotiating positions in trade discussions. The American intelligence community was particularly angry about revelations that their most sensitive secrets about military capabilities and intelligence operations had been compromised through royal indiscretions. CIA Director William Burns reportedly told his British counterpart that the relationship between the two agencies would need to be completely rebuilt from scratch. As March progressed, more intelligence officers came forward with their own accounts of royal security breaches and intelligence service corruption. The picture that emerged was of a security establishment that had been systematically corrupted by its relationship with the monarchy, placing personal loyalty to the crown above professional duty to protect national interests. The psychological impact on intelligence professionals was profound. Many had spent their entire careers believing that they were protecting Britain from foreign threats, only to discover that they had actually been facilitating those very threats through their protection of royal security breaches. The cognitive dissonance was overwhelming, and several senior officers reportedly suffered mental health crises as they grappled with the implications of their actions. The operational impact was equally severe. British intelligence operations around the world had to be reviewed and, in many cases, shut down because of fears that they had been compromised. Agents who had spent years building cover identities and developing sources found their work destroyed overnight as foreign security services implemented new protocols to identify and counter British operations. The technology implications were also staggering. British intelligence agencies discovered that foreign services had gained access to some of their most sensitive technical capabilities through royal connections. Encryption systems, surveillance technologies, and cyber warfare capabilities had all been compromised, requiring massive investments in new security measures. Wright's investigation also revealed how the security services had failed in their basic mission to protect the royal family themselves from foreign manipulation. Instead of recognizing and countering foreign intelligence operations targeting the monarchy, they had actively facilitated those operations in the name of royal protection. The failure was so complete that several foreign intelligence services had reportedly been competing with each other to gain influence with different royal family members, turning the palace into a battleground for international espionage operations. The monarchy had become a liability rather than an asset for British national security. As the month drew to a close, it became clear that the security scandal would have lasting consequences for Britain's position in the world. The country's intelligence capabilities had been systematically undermined, its relationships with key allies had been damaged, and its reputation for competence and reliability had been destroyed. The royal family found themselves in the unprecedented position of being seen not as symbols of national strength and continuity, but as security risks who posed a fundamental threat to British national interests. Their constitutional role as ceremonial head of the armed forces and guarantor of national security was now being openly questioned by the very people whose job it was to protect them. The intelligence community itself was calling for fundamental reforms that would strip the royal family of access to classified information and remove them from any role in national security decision-making. The idea that the monarchy could continue to play a meaningful role in protecting British interests was now seen as not just outdated, but actively dangerous. The betrayal was complete, and the consequences would be felt for generations to come. Lady Catherine Winford had been a friend to the royal family for over 4 decades, moving in their intimate social circles since her debutante days in the 1980s. She had kept their secrets, protected their reputations, and maintained absolute loyalty through marriages, divorces, scandals, and tragedies. But, on April 12, 2025, sitting in the drawing room of her Cotswolds estate with tears streaming down her face, she was about to break that loyalty in the most devastating way possible. The journalist sitting across from her, Rebecca Stone from the Sunday Times, had been pursuing this interview for weeks. Stone had built a reputation as one of Britain's most tenacious investigative reporters, specializing in stories about the intersection of power, privilege, and personal destruction. But even she was unprepared for what Lady Catherine was about to reveal about the private lives of the people she had once considered her closest friends. Catherine's decision to speak publicly had been agonizing. The financial scandals, the security breaches, and the institutional corruption had already devastated the monarchy's public reputation. But she possessed knowledge of personal behaviors and private activities that would destroy the royal family not just as public figures, but as human beings. The question that had tormented her for weeks was whether the public had a right to know these most intimate secrets, or whether some truths were too destructive to ever be revealed. What finally convinced her to speak was a conversation she had overheard between Prince William and his private secretary just days earlier. They had been discussing strategies for managing the narrative and controlling the damage, seemingly oblivious to the genuine human suffering their family's actions had caused. Catherine realized that they saw the crisis purely in terms of public relations rather than moral accountability, and that convinced her that more drastic measures were necessary to force them to confront reality. The first revelation Catherine shared was about Prince Harry's secret struggle with severe mental health issues that went far beyond anything he had publicly acknowledged. She described witnessing him during psychotic episodes, talking to people who weren't there, becoming violent toward staff members, and engaging in self-destructive behaviors that required constant supervision and medical intervention. The palace had covered up these incidents for years, Catherine explained, using a network of private doctors, discreet security personnel, and loyal staff members who signed extensive non-disclosure agreements. Harry's public advocacy for mental health awareness was, in Catherine's account, partly motivated by guilt over his own untreated conditions and the family's refusal to seek proper professional help for fear of public embarrassment. Even more shocking was Catherine's description of the systematic emotional abuse that had taken place within the royal family for generations. She described witnessing Prince Philip's violent rages, during which he would physically attack family members and staff. She had seen Queen Elizabeth deliberately humiliate her own children in front of guests, using their personal vulnerabilities as weapons in family disputes. The abuse had created a cycle of dysfunction that had been passed down through generations. Catherine described how Prince Charles had inherited his father's capacity for cruelty, regularly destroying his son's self-esteem through calculated emotional attacks that left lasting psychological scars. The public image of a loving, supportive family was, in Catherine's account, a carefully constructed facade hiding decades of systematic abuse. Catherine's most devastating revelations concerned the royal family's attitudes toward the people they were supposed to serve. She described private conversations in which family members expressed open contempt for the British public, referring to them as peasants and breeding stock who existed solely to provide financial support and adulation for their social superiors. She recounted dinner party conversations where royal family members had laughed about the financial hardships facing ordinary families, joking about food bank usage and homelessness as if the suffering of their subjects was entertainment. The callousness and complete lack of empathy were, in Catherine's description, far worse than any financial corruption or security breach. The personal stories Catherine told revealed the extent to which the royal family had used their positions to exploit and abuse vulnerable people. She described how Prince Andrew had not just associated with Jeffrey Epstein, but had actively participated in recruiting young women for sexual exploitation, using his royal status to overcome their reluctance and silence their later attempts to seek justice. Catherine provided detailed accounts of royal family members using their charitable foundations as personal dating services, identifying attractive young volunteers who could be groomed for sexual relationships. The power dynamic made meaningful consent impossible, she argued, turning charitable work into a predatory hunting ground for sexual exploitation. She also revealed the family's systematic racism, describing private conversations filled with racial slurs and expressions of disgust toward Commonwealth countries with predominantly non-white populations. The public commitment to multiculturalism and racial equality was, Catherine claimed, completely contradicted by private attitudes that belonged in the colonial era. The revelations about Meghan Markle's treatment were particularly damaging. Catherine described witnessing deliberate campaigns of psychological harassment designed to drive her away from the family. Senior royals had systematically undermined her confidence, isolated her from potential allies, and created impossible situations where she would be criticized regardless of her choices. The racism Meghan faced was not subtle or unconscious, Catherine revealed, but deliberate and calculated. Family members had made explicit comments about not wanting mixed-race grandchildren and had discussed strategies for minimizing the influence of Harry's foreign wife on future royal succession. Catherine's testimony also exposed the royal family's attitude toward their staff, whom they treated as disposable servants rather than human beings. She described witnessing sexual harassment, financial exploitation, and deliberate humiliation of employees who had no recourse for complaint because of the power dynamics involved. Staff members who witnessed inappropriate behavior or raised concerns about illegal activities were routinely fired and threatened with legal action if they spoke publicly about their experiences. The palace had created a culture of fear and intimidation that ensured loyalty through terror rather than respect. The personal financial behavior of royal family members was even more shocking than the institutional corruption that had already been revealed. Catherine described watching them steal from charitable donations, pocket gifts intended for worthy causes, and demand personal payments for appearances at events that were supposed to be acts of public service. She witnessed Prince William selling access to private royal events to wealthy foreigners who were willing to pay hundreds of thousands of pounds for the privilege of social interaction with future monarchs. The commercialization of royal access had created a shadow economy where everything from private dinners to photo opportunities was available for purchase by the highest bidder. The drug use within the royal family was far more extensive than anything that had been previously reported. Catherine described regular cocaine use at royal events, prescription drug addiction among several family members, and the use of royal aircraft to transport illegal substances to private estates where drug-fueled parties would continue for days. The sexual behavior was equally disturbing. Catherine described witnessing what amounted to sexual assault at royal gatherings, with family members using their status to coerce unwilling participants into sexual activities. The atmosphere at private royal events was, in her description, reminiscent of the worst excesses of historical royal courts, where power and privilege created environments of systematic exploitation. Catherine also revealed the extent to which the royal family had interfered in the justice system to protect themselves and their allies from accountability. She described phone calls to judges, payments to prosecutors, and threats to police officers who were investigating royal connections to criminal activities. The corruption of the justice system was so extensive that Catherine questioned whether any meaningful accountability was possible within the existing legal framework. The royal family had essentially placed themselves above the law through a combination of constitutional protections, financial corruption, and systematic intimidation of anyone who attempted to hold them accountable. The psychological impact of these revelations on the British public was immediate and profound. People who had spent their entire lives respecting and admiring the royal family found themselves confronting evidence that their heroes were not just flawed human beings, but systematic abusers who had exploited their positions for personal gain while showing contempt for the people they claimed to serve. The international reaction was equally swift and devastating. Commonwealth countries that had maintained their constitutional ties to the British monarchy out of respect and tradition found themselves associated with an institution that had been revealed as fundamentally corrupt and abusive. Republican movements that had been dormant for decades suddenly found themselves with overwhelming public support. Religious leaders who had traditionally supported the monarchy as a force for moral leadership found themselves unable to defend an institution that had been shown to embody the worst aspects of human nature. The Archbishop of Canterbury issued a statement expressing profound disappointment and calling for serious reflection on the monarchy's future role. Catherine's revelations also had immediate practical consequences for the royal family's day-to-day existence. Staff members began resigning en masse as her accounts of abuse and exploitation became public. Security personnel who had protected royal family members for years found themselves questioning whether their clients deserved protection from the consequences of their actions. The psychological pressure on the royal family themselves was intense. Catherine described receiving desperate phone calls from Princess Kate, who was apparently struggling with severe depression as she grappled with the reality of what her husband's family had done and her own complicity in covering up their crimes. Prince William reportedly had a complete nervous breakdown when confronted with the evidence of his family's behavior, requiring hospitalization for what was officially described as exhaustion but which Catherine suggested was actually a complete psychological collapse under the weight of shame and guilt. The younger royals found themselves in impossible positions, forced to choose between loyalty to their family and their own moral integrity. Several reportedly considered public repudiation of their relatives, but were warned by advisors that such actions would destroy any possibility of reforming the monarchy from within. As April drew to a close, it became clear that Catherine's revelations had accomplished what financial scandals and security breaches could not. They had destroyed the emotional and psychological foundation that had allowed the monarchy to maintain public support despite its institutional failures. The royal family was no longer seen as a dysfunctional but ultimately well-meaning institution that had been corrupted by circumstances. They were now viewed as fundamentally malicious individuals who had used their positions to cause deliberate harm to vulnerable people while enriching themselves at public expense. The personal destruction was complete, and there seemed to be no path back to public acceptance or respect. The monarchy had been exposed not just as institutionally corrupt, but as personally evil, and that revelation would prove impossible to overcome. The morning of May 20, 2025, dawned grey and rainy over London, as if the weather itself reflected the somber mood that had settled over the United Kingdom. In a small conference room in Downing Street, Prime Minister Rishi Sunak sat with his most senior advisors, preparing for what would become known as the most consequential political decision in British history since the English Civil War. The question before them was simple in its phrasing but earth-shattering in its implications: should the British monarchy be abolished? The crisis that had begun with Sarah Mitchell's discovery in the Royal Archives had now consumed 4 months of national attention and international scrutiny. What had started as a historical curiosity had become an existential threat to the British constitutional system. The financial crimes, security breaches, and personal scandals had combined to create a perfect storm that had destroyed public confidence in the royal family and raised fundamental questions about the viability of constitutional monarchy in the modern world. Sir Anthony Seldon, the cabinet secretary and head of the civil service, had been tasked with providing a comprehensive assessment of the monarchy's future viability. His report, which would later be known as the Seldon Assessment, painted a picture of an institution so thoroughly corrupted and compromised that meaningful reform might be impossible. The financial investigation led by Dr. Elizabeth Turner had ultimately uncovered evidence of criminal activity totaling over £5 billion across 3 decades. The money laundering operation had involved dozens of countries, hundreds of financial institutions, and thousands of individual transactions. The scale of the corruption was so vast that international law enforcement agencies were still struggling to map all of its connections and identify all of its victims. The security assessment conducted by Sir David Wright had concluded that the monarchy posed an ongoing national security threat that could not be mitigated without fundamentally altering the constitutional relationship between the Crown and the state. The intelligence breaches had been so extensive and so damaging that Britain's allies were now treating the country as a potential security risk rather than a trusted partner. The personal revelations provided by Lady Catherine Winford and dozens of other former royal associates had destroyed any possibility of moral rehabilitation for the institution. The evidence of systematic abuse, exploitation, and criminal behavior was so overwhelming that public opinion polls showed support for the monarchy had collapsed to single digits for the first time in recorded history. But the political challenge facing the government was unprecedented. Abolishing the monarchy would require constitutional changes so fundamental that they would essentially amount to creating a new form of government. Every law, every government institution, and every international treaty would need to be reviewed and potentially restructured to remove references to royal authority. The legal complexities were staggering. Britain's entire constitutional system was built around the concept of crown authority, with Parliament deriving its legitimacy from royal consent and the government operating as representatives of the crown. Removing the monarchy would require not just new legislation, but a complete reconceptualization of how British democracy functioned. International implications were equally complex. The monarch served as head of state for 15 Commonwealth realms, and several of these countries had already indicated that they would seek republican status if the British monarchy was abolished. The Commonwealth itself, an association of 54 nations built around shared historical ties to the British Crown, would likely collapse entirely. Economic consequences were also severe but complicated. While the monarchy brought significant tourism revenue to Britain, the corruption scandals had already begun to damage that income stream. International investors were expressing concerns about the stability of British institutions, and several major financial firms had moved operations to other countries to avoid association with the royal scandals. The immediate political pressure facing the government was intense from every direction. Opposition parties were demanding immediate action to remove the royal family from all official positions, while some conservative backbenchers were still arguing for patience and gradual reform. Protest movements that had begun as small demonstrations outside Buckingham Palace had grown into massive rallies demanding republican government. Public opinion was shifting rapidly as new revelations continued to emerge almost daily. The Metropolitan Police had finally begun formal criminal investigations into royal activities, but their progress was being hampered by the constitutional protections surrounding the monarchy and the systematic destruction of evidence that had apparently been taking place for months. International pressure was building as well. The European Union had imposed limited sanctions on British financial institutions connected to royal money laundering, while the United States had suspended several intelligence sharing agreements pending resolution of the security breaches. Even traditionally friendly Commonwealth nations were distancing themselves from the British Crown. Behind the scenes, senior civil servants were reportedly preparing detailed plans for governmental transition scenarios ranging from limited constitutional monarchy to full republican democracy. The complexity of these preparations was unprecedented, requiring coordination between every government department and careful consideration of thousands of legal and practical details. The royal family themselves had effectively withdrawn from public life entirely. Buckingham Palace had been closed to tourists, all official engagements had been cancelled, and most family members were reportedly staying at private estates under heavy security protection. Their few public statements had been defensive and legalistic, showing no recognition of the magnitude of the crisis or acceptance of responsibility for their actions. King Charles, who had waited his entire life to inherit the throne, found himself facing the possibility that he might be the last British monarch. Reports suggested that he was suffering from severe depression and had been hospitalized several times for what were officially described as minor health issues but which insiders suggested were actually mental health crises. Prince William and Princess Kate were reportedly considering whether to renounce their positions in the line of succession in an attempt to distance themselves from the scandal. Such an action would be unprecedented in modern royal history, but several constitutional experts had suggested that it might be the only way for the younger generation to salvage any possibility of public respect. The international monarchist community was watching the British crisis with growing alarm, recognizing that the collapse of the British monarchy could trigger republican movements in other constitutional monarchies around the world. The Swedish, Dutch, and Canadian governments were all facing increased pressure from Republican groups who argued that the British example proved that constitutional monarchy was incompatible with modern democratic values. As May progressed, it became increasingly clear that some form of dramatic action was inevitable. The scandal had reached a point where ignoring it or hoping it would fade away was no longer politically viable. Public pressure was building toward a breaking point, and maintaining the status quo would likely lead to even more destructive political and social consequences. The government's options were essentially limited to two choices: implement radical reforms that would strip the monarchy of most of its constitutional powers and financial privileges, or move toward complete abolition and the establishment of a republican system of government. Both options carried enormous risks and would require unprecedented political courage to implement. Moderate reform options that might have been viable earlier in the crisis were no longer sufficient given the scale of the revelations about royal corruption and abuse. Public trust had been so thoroughly destroyed that anything short of fundamental change would be seen as inadequate and would likely lead to even greater political instability. On May 18, Sunak made the decision that would define his political legacy and potentially change the course of British history. He announced that the government would introduce emergency legislation to begin the process of constitutional reform that would ultimately lead to the establishment of a British Republic. The announcement sent shockwaves through the political establishment and triggered immediate constitutional crises in several Commonwealth countries. But opinion polls showed overwhelming public support for the decision, with nearly 80% of respondents indicating that they believed the monarchy had lost the moral authority necessary to serve as head of state. The legislation, known as the Constitutional Reform Act 2025, would establish a complex transition process lasting several years and culminating in the formal abolition of the monarchy and the establishment of an elected head of state. The royal family would retain private ownership of their personal properties but would lose all public funding and official status. International reaction was swift and generally supportive. The European Union announced that it looked forward to working with a modern, democratic British Republic. The United States indicated that the change might actually strengthen the bilateral relationship by removing some of the institutional complexities that had complicated cooperation. Several Commonwealth nations announced almost immediately that they would use the British transition as an opportunity to establish their own republican governments. Australia and Canada both indicated that they would hold referendums on becoming republics, while smaller Caribbean nations began drafting new constitutions that would remove all references to the British Crown. The transition process itself would be enormously complex, requiring the rewriting of thousands of laws, the restructuring of government institutions, and the negotiation of new international agreements. But the political momentum was now unstoppable, and it seemed clear that Britain was embarking on the most significant constitutional change in its history. The royal family's final public statement was brief and dignified, expressing regret for the crisis and indicating that they would cooperate with the transition process. But privately, family members were reportedly devastated by the collapse of an institution that had defined their entire identities and purpose in life. As the country prepared for its republican future, there was a sense both of historical vindication and profound loss. The monarchy had been part of British identity for over 1,000 years, and its abolition represented not just a political change but a fundamental transformation of national character. But the evidence of systematic corruption, abuse, and criminal behavior had made that transformation inevitable. The monarchy had destroyed itself through its own actions, and the British people had finally decided that some institutions were too corrupt to reform and too dangerous to preserve. The final reckoning was complete, and Britain was about to begin a new chapter in its history as a modern republic, free from the corrupting influence of hereditary privilege and the systematic abuse of power that had characterized the final years of the British monarchy. The 1,000-year-old institution was ending not with ceremony or celebration, but with shame, scandal, and the recognition that even the most ancient and respected institutions could fall when they betrayed the trust of the people they claimed to serve. The British Republic would rise from the ashes of royal corruption, offering hope that democratic institutions could be reformed and renewed even in the face of the most devastating scandals. The story that had begun with a curious archivist opening a forgotten filing cabinet had ultimately resulted in the peaceful overthrow of one of the world's oldest monarchies and the birth of a new democratic republic. It was a reminder that in the modern world, no institution, no matter how powerful or ancient, was immune from accountability when the truth was finally revealed.